Hello everyone, welcome to StudyIQ. Today we have with us Mr. Dhiraj Nayyar, an economist who is currently working with the Vedanta Group as the head of economics and policy. He has also worked with the NITI Aayog and with various media organizations over the years. He has studied from the elite institutes like Cambridge, and we welcome him today on StudyIQ to talk about economics and the current economic scenario of the country. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So I would like to ask you with the first question that I would like to ask you is, what do you think about the lockdown opening? So we have opened the economy after 9 weeks of lockdown and the cases are still going up. So what is your view about that?
Yeah, so it's a difficult situation undoubtedly. Most other countries imposed a lockdown later and lifted it only after the curve had the so-called flatten, what you call flatten the curve once the numbers had started decreasing. But in India, we imposed a lockdown early, but for various reasons, and there's a lot we don't know about this virus and how it spreads. For various reasons, we are still seeing an increase in numbers. But I think the economic compulsions became so acute that there was a need to open up the economy because I think livelihoods were at stake along with lives. So I think India needs to achieve a balance between lives and livelihoods in this difficult situation. I think you could have continued the lockdown a little longer had the government come out with a bigger package and a bigger fiscal package. But since the government is of the view that it doesn't want to overspend at this point, I think there was no option but to open up the economy. The only thing I would say is that what we should really do is that there are clearly 4 or 5 cities and centers which are the epicenter of this virus right now, say Delhi, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Chennai, Pune. We know 5-6 cities. I think over here, perhaps the unlocking is a little too liberal. I would not, for example, right now allow the opening of religious worship places or malls or places where crowds can gather. I think that could be given a little bit of time. And I think stricter policies need to be imposed in the containment zones and more contact tracing, more testing. I think they're not testing enough. The one condition on which countries unlock is that you test a lot more to make sure that you can contain, where the virus is and you can contain it. So I think there are such small problems, but I think overall unlocking was something that they had to do. I mean, how long will you continue the lockdown? The virus may continue to rise for another 5 or 6 weeks. And, in 5 or 6 weeks, too many people in the economy would either be bankrupt or possibly even dead. So I think it's a serious situation, and the government and the state governments and the union government are trying their best to manage it. But it's a tough situation. Nobody has done this before. So everybody is trying to figure out what is the best strategy, as you go along.
Okay. My next question is regarding the reverse migration. So we have seen a lot of labor and working class people migrate from the metro cities like Mumbai and Delhi back to states like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh. So what is your take on this reverse migration? There is some talk that it will benefit the rural economies of states like Bihar and maybe they need to industrialize it. But what will happen in the next 1 year or 2 years? Can they industrialize so quickly?
No, I don't think they can. That's the realistic answer. And I don't think the going back at this point is going to benefit those states, because ultimately, what are they going to do right now when they go back? They're all going to get into some kind of agricultural activity. And as you already know, India's workforce in agriculture overall is about more than 40% of the workforce is in agriculture and producing only 13% of GDP. So this will only add that number and lower productivity in agriculture, because agriculture may do better than other sectors of the economy, as a matter of fact, in the next 6 months, but still it cannot support such a large workforce. So I think in the medium term, if you're looking at 1 year or 2 years, I don't think this reverse migration is good for the economy as a whole, or even good for the states. On the other hand, if in looking at a period of more than 2 years, perhaps looking at a period of 4 or 5 years, if this reverse migration makes the states like UP, Bihar, Odisha, West Bengal, where the migrants are coming from, realize that they need to industrialize more and they need to create more productive jobs for their citizens, then it may be a good thing, because this is the backward part of the country still in terms of industrialization, in terms of incomes. And the only way they'll catch up with the rest of India, this west and south and north, is if they industrialize in a big way. So I think if this is a trigger, if this reality check acts as a in motivation for these states to industrialize. For example, I see Yogi Adityanath has made several statements and has shown his intentions that he does want to industrialize UP. He wants to attract firms from China, which are exiting China. I think those are all good things. So if he and the other CMs of the states which are currently trailing the more advanced states take this as an opportunity, then I think it will work over the next 4 or 5 years. But unfortunately, it's unlikely to give you very big dividends in 1 year. I don't think anyone's going to come in such a hurry.
Just a follow-up question to this. Now, the MG Narega enrollments have increased because of all the people migrating to rural areas. So how do you think will that impact the overall status of economy? Will that be helpful, or what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I look at it this way. If you look at it from the point of the migrants who've gone back in distress because they didn't have any livelihood in the cities, then obviously they will be better off. At least they'll get a MGNR, EGA wage for 100 days and some work for 100 days in a year. So in that sense, they're better off than they would be in a city where they would have absolutely no income if the SMEs and construction sector and the major sectors where they work are not operating or operating at well below scale. So I think in that sense, it's good. And to the extent that these people are getting some money in their pockets, they will spend it. So it can't be bad for the economy. But I think, again, in the short term, this is a sort of palliative measure for the weaker sections. But I think going ahead, looking at more than 6 months, it's not a good situation to be in. You don't want more people to start depending on MG, NR, EGA. You want people to be in productive jobs, higher paying jobs than that. But I think in the short run, it's acting like a safety net, and it will sort of save livelihoods, and it will give a bit of boost to demand also.
All right. Next, we'll come to the 20 lakh crore package that was announced by the government last month. So that package mostly was in the form of loans to MSMEs and other sectors, and some of it was part of the RBI's liquidity infusion. According to you, is that the correct approach to revive the economy that is slowly going into a slump? What alternative method could have been done by the government?
I think it's partly correct. I mean, it is correct in the sense that you need those supply side measures. You need those easy liquidity measures, because the one thing you don't want in a crisis like this is an unprecedented shock to the economy on both the demand side and supply side. The one thing you don't want is SMEs or other companies, even large companies. You don't want companies which are viable to go bankrupt, to shut down, because then there'll be no recovery. If the viable firms shut down during this tough period, then who's going to lead your recovery when things start to open up? So I think in that sense, liquidity support and support on the loan side is important, but I don't think it's sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient, because these are supply side interventions. And while the supply side is important, until demand revives, the fact is that supply cannot pick up in any significant way. So I think while these measures will help firms, individuals, critical sectors survive this crisis, what they need to recover and grow is people to spend on the other side. So I think what I would like to see, and I hope that it will come in the next 2 or 3 months, a greater demand side stimulus. 2 aspects to it. One is putting in cash directly into the hands of the poorish, maybe more cash transfers. But that's not the only thing. The second, I think, is that you need a massive public works program. You need massive public investment, because in this environment, private investment will not come until it has the confidence that growth has recovered. And growth can only recover with public investment. So therefore, government, if it does for example, a massive housing program. I mean, look at these poor migrants who've migrated back to their villages in distress. They don't have places to stay in cities. Similarly, healthcare, we can see our healthcare infrastructure is struggling now as the cases rise in places like Delhi and Bombay. So I think big investment, public investment in health, housing, these are all worth it for the economy, for growth, for productivity, for social security. So if necessary, I'm not even against the idea of monetizing some amount of the debt to invest in this. So if the government feels that it doesn't want to borrow because that borrowing will raise interest rates and crowd out private investment, it can ask the RBI to monetize part of the debt. I realize this is not an easy thing for the government to do, because this is, in normal circumstances, a bad habit to monetize your debt. But I think these are extraordinary circumstances, and a demand side boost through a massive housing investment in housing, public housing and public health. Roads, of course, this government has already been doing. But I think that kind of stimulus is definitely required in the next 2 or 3 months, so that growth comes back and then private investment gets crowded in.
All right. So these loans that have been provided to MSMEs or will be provided to MSMEs, don't you think that they will affect the NPA problem in 2019, after a gap of about 3 or 4 years, we saw a decrease in the NPA of public sector banks. It came to about 9%. Now, again, if the government does not get the loans back, if the MSMEs fail to repay the loans, then the NPAs will increase drastically, and it will increase another problem of the economy that we are trying to control since many years.
Yeah, but you can see this is also a catch-22 situation. If the government doesn't give those loans right now, the emergency loans, then you will have a number of SMEs and other companies going bankrupt, and that will also lead to a increased NPA problem. So I think right now the situation is that either you let companies go under by not offering them support, and that will raise the NPAs, or you come out with a scheme, as the government I think has absolutely correctly done, to support the MSMEs. And maybe some of them will not recover, but I think a majority will. So I think this move, if you look at it 2-3 years from now, will actually have led to a stabilization or decrease in NPAs rather than the other way around. I think the other option, which is to let companies go bankrupt, is worse for NPAs, it's worse for growth, it's worse for jobs. So I think no options. I've been saying this for a while, that there are no good options in this crisis, in the sense that everything is risky because of so much uncertainty. But I think it's still the right move, and it will probably leads to a decrease in NPAs in the medium term in my view.
All right. Next, talking about the reforms that the government has undertaken. Now, in this COVID-19 crisis, they have brought in agricultural reforms. So don't you think this is the correct time to bring land reforms, which have been much delayed in the country? Always there's a pushback from the political lobby whenever the government tries to bring some land reforms regarding industry.
No, I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. I'm very, very happy that the agricultural reforms have come, because agriculture was one sector which did not get any market reform since 1991. So, some of the things which we've given agriculture now, for example, farmers the right to sell where they want, was a right that industry has had for a long, long time. So I think in that sense, it's good that it's come. Even if it's come late, it's at least come. But on the land front, I think that is, when we talk about industrialization or attracting firms from China or Make in India, land is critical. Without land, there is no manufacturing. You cannot set up factories and so on. And given our land laws, and the last amendment to the Land Acquisition Act, which was in 2013, has made it more or less impossible to acquire large amounts of land for industry. So I think that definitely needs to change. And I think this is the time, certainly. I think the crisis gives you an opportunity, because those vested interests you hinted at in your question, the people who block such reform tend to get weaker in a crisis, because the urgent need for reform and the urgent need to do something to boost jobs and the economy is so great that vested interests somehow seem a little less loud than they are in normal times. So I think that in that sense, it's a great time. The one constraint to land acquisition and land reform is land titling. I think a lot of people in India are reluctant about land acquisition because they are not sure of their title to land. So some states like Gujarat and Karnataka have digitized land records and have given clear land titles and so on. I think some other states are also moving in that direction. But I think all state governments need to make a very big effort over the next 6 or 8 months. We have the technology, we have the resources, digitize land records and clear land titling. Because I think once people are confident that if their land is acquired, they will get the compensation, then they will be more willing to sell. So I think amend the land acquisition policy, but at the same time also make sure that the land titling and land ownership is very clear.
Okay. Now, Dhiraj sir, you work with NITI Aayog in the trade aspect, and recently we have seen that Vietnam has signed a trade agreement with European Union. On the other hand, India's treaty with European Union has been lagging. It has not been signed since many years. Why do you think there's such problems arising in India and EU agreements?
So I think again, the trade agreements we've signed so far, the free trade agreements India has signed so far, are with countries like Japan, Korea, ASEAN, East Asia, basically. And I think there's been a certain opposition to them because these countries are very, very strong in manufacturing, and India is not very strong in manufacturing. Our cost base is higher than the cost base of these countries. So in terms of manufacturing, our manufacturing suffers. But with EU and the US, we would definitely be more competitive in manufacturing than those countries are, because their wages and their other regulations and all are so difficult and so tight. The wages are high and the regulations are tight, that it's not competitive to manufacture there. That's why China has been selling to EU and the US for decades now. So I think India definitely needs to have FTAs with those markets much more than it needs to have FTAs with the East Asian markets. I think where we again get stuck is on certain sensitive areas like agriculture, cheese, dairy farming, wine, kind of products that EU would like to export, but there are interests here which want to block those. But I think in the longer term, if we want to be a manufacturing hub, and if we are saying we want to attract firms from China to manufacture in India, those firms want to export to the world. They don't want to sell only in India. They will make for India, but they want to make in India for the world. And for that, they need market access. So if Vietnam has an FTA with EU, then those firms will go to Vietnam and will not come to India because they can sell more easily to the EU if they manufacture in Vietnam. So I think in the medium term, we are going to again lose more of our competitive advantage in manufacturing if other countries like Vietnam and say Bangladesh and other countries integrate more closely with EU and US, and we miss out on that bus. So I think we should double down on negotiating with the advanced country markets, because I think that's where we'll really exploit our comparative advantage. We haven't been able to do that in East Asia, but I think we can do that with EU and the US. So we should definitely work on it. But all free trade agreements, all trade liberalization involves winners and losers. A lot of people will gain, but a minority will lose. And it's a matter of managing the conflict between that. So the losers will shout very loudly. We also know that. So therefore, it's a matter of political negotiation and strategy to how do you manage the losers while making sure that the winners are substantial.
The Indian economy is almost certain to go into recession due to the COVID-19 crisis. So what is your thinking that how many, let me just reframe that. So the Indian economy is going into recession, as many of the think tanks and economic experts are saying. How long do you think will it take for the economy to get back to the levels of 2019 or maybe the third quarter of 2019-20 financial year?
So I would say we'll get a recovery in 2020-21. So I think, sorry, not 2020-21. 2020-21 is likely to be a bad year. It'll probably be the worst year I think we've had in independent India in terms of growth is 1979, which was I think minus 5.2 or something like that. So we'll probably end up with somewhere around that. Depends on how much of a stimulus the government is willing to give now. I think where we end up this year also depends on that. So if the government is willing to open its purse strings and give a stimulus of 3-4% of GDP, which I think it should, then we may end up closer to -1, 0, that kind of territory rather than -5 or below. And I think the recovery will then begin the next year. But if there's a stimulus, big stimulus now, maybe in the last quarter of this year, we will start seeing a decent recovery. Let's also not forget that there's also the health crisis, which we don't know enough about. So what we are seeing right now is that it goes to a peak and then is coming down in the countries which started before us. So eventually we hope that in another 2-3 months, it will subside, or by the end of the year, we have a vaccine or some kind of treatment. If that happens, then I certainly see a recovery in the last quarter of this year, but a bounce back in the next financial year, 21-22.
Okay. And the government had a target of becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2024-25. So when do you think that target will be achieved now? There will be some shifting of the goalpost, I guess.
Yeah, I think 2024-25 was a very optimistic time frame. In any case, we would have needed almost 8 to 10% growth on a yearly basis every year. Now, clearly this year we are going to be in negative territory, so that doesn't help. And so next year we may well reach 7 or 8%. But I think 28, 29, 30, we should strive to get there as quickly as possible. My target would rather be, let's get growth to 8 to 10% on a sustained basis. Then 5 trillion, 10 trillion, they'll follow very, very quickly and automatically. If we aim for 5 trillion or 10 trillion without aiming for a high rate of growth, we will get there eventually, but it may take us 30 years, to get to 10 trillion, which is not good enough. We need to get there very fast. So my focus would be on targeting a growth rate, which would be at least 8 to 10% every year. And then you will see this 5 trillion, 10 trillion will achieve very, very rapidly. I think anyway, the government seems to have, in its recent package, changed the narrative a little away from 5 trillion to Atmanirbhar Bharat. So I think they themselves realize that 5 trillion is not going to happen by 24-25. But whatever the strategy, whatever the narrative, let's get 8 to 10% growth, and your overall GDP number will take care of itself.
So you just talked about the Atmanirbhar Bharat, and a question came to my mind that do you think this Atmanirbhar Abhiyan or Atmanirbhar, the trajectory which we are going to, is this the same as Make in India, or is it a bit different from Make in India?
Well, Make in India is an eminently sensible and important goal, which was, of course, announced in the first term of the Modi government. And before that, also in various ways, we've been trying to make in India for a long time, but we haven't succeeded. So percentage of manufacturing in GDP has remained around 15% despite all these initiatives and despite all these programs. Now I'm hopeful that whatever the details of this Atmanirbhar Bharat, and we're yet to see the many policy details, but what I've seen so far, it involves a certain amount of structural reform in agriculture, hopefully in land and labor. If we do those reforms, so if Atmanirbhar Bharat means that we are serious about doing those reforms which will boost manufacturing, then I think it's a good thing. Otherwise, it will remain a aspiration and we won't reach it. So I think we need to convert the aspiration into reality. And I hope this time around, we are willing to do the tough reforms which will give us that Atmanirbharta.
All right. Now, this recession that is going to come in India's economy, is this going to be like a normal recession that is usually followed by deflation, or do you think that this time it will be a bit different? There will be no deflation?
Well, I think if we don't do a big fiscal stimulus, we are going to get into a deflationary type of situation. And those kind of situations are not good and difficult to get out of. So I would, at this point, unfortunately, the fiscal hawks worry about inflation a lot. And even in this scenario, they seem to be worrying about the potential inflationary consequences of a big stimulus. But I don't think, I would agree with you that the worry right now is deflation, not inflation. So I would therefore strongly recommend a bigger fiscal package and bigger fiscal stimulus.
Now, coming to the home work culture or work from home culture that has started in India, and it has gained a lot of momentum due to the lockdown. Do you think it's a temporary necessity and companies will revert back to working from offices, or this is going to stay here for long and companies are going to free up their office space and give up on all the rental the expenditure they have for work from home lifestyle or work style?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting question and interesting prospect, because I think nothing works like a real life pilot experiment. So I think everybody now has got a taste over the last 2 or 3 months of we always think about what work from home may mean and what no offices will mean, but now we know, and a lot of firms I think are figuring out that it works. There may be certain essential jobs which require people coming into the shop floor or factory or an office. But in a lot of cases, for example, the sort of startups and the tech companies, I think a lot of them are realizing that, their engineers and coders and everybody else can be equally productive from home. So, and the cost of real estate, especially in big cities, as you know, is extremely high. And it's a big cost to various businesses. So I think it's going to be interesting. I think some businesses, especially the newer ones, are going to seriously think about, working from home, perhaps the concept of shared office space or coming in once or twice a week. So it may not be completely work from home, but you may come in a couple of times a week. It may be a hybrid model of, not taking a permanent workspace, but taking part of a shared workspace. So I think different models are going to come up. Already the culture of shared workspaces was coming up before this crisis. So I think you're going to see an interesting churn there. But some of the traditional companies may still go back to working from office. I think there is still benefits to working from office. There's no substitute to people actually sitting together, the social capital that comes out of it, the intellectual capital that comes out of people just sitting together, brainstorming, and collectively coming up with solutions to the problems and challenges. So that is also there. I don't think that human interaction bit is going to go away, and the actual sitting together and think and talking. So some form of getting together will still have to happen. Now, whether it happens in an exclusive 6-story office space or whether it will happen in a small 1-floor office space, which people will come in on alternate days of the week, which will save you on cost, which will save you on energy, that remains to be seen. But I think what would have been impossible to think of 2 or 3 months ago is now very much in the realm of possibility, because people have seen that it can work. And through the forum we are talking on right now, Zoom, and the several other technology platforms that we have, I think technology, Wi-Fi, the fact that we have cheap Wi-Fi in India, we have that essential infrastructure which enables this. So if we didn't have any of this, then we wouldn't be talking about work from home. But we have the platform, we have the pilot experiment. Let's see where the companies go. But I certainly think some companies, the newer companies, the younger generation of companies is going to move away from the traditional office model.
All right. Now, talking about the foreign investment in India. So Moody's recently downgraded the rating of India to BAA minus, Baa3 minus. How do you think will that impact India's foreign investment in the coming 2 years or coming 1 year?
So I think right now you see everybody and every investor and every stakeholder realizes that there's an extraordinary situation in the global economy and the Indian economy. Like nobody has spared the effects of this crisis. So I think the Moody's downgrade, other agencies are holding their rating. This is not a big shock or unexpected. Ultimately, what I think will attract or not attract foreign investors is two things. One is, of course, the policy changes we've been talking about, land and labor and so on. That is one thing which has to be done. And the second is growth. Everybody comes to a growing market. Nobody will come to a country which is contracting or in protracted recession. So I think the priority for the government is not to worry too much about any of these ratings, but to get its continuous reform and get growth back. And if that needs a fiscal stimulus, so be it. Because I think one of the worries is that if you monetize debt or if you do a fiscal stimulus at this stage, the agencies like Moody's will frown upon it. But I think they'll frown upon negative growth even more than they'll frown upon fiscal expansion. So I think focus on growth, do what it takes to get growth back, and stick to your guns on policy reform. And then you don't have to worry about Moody's, S&P. Investors will come. Investors will follow growth and they'll follow a good policy environment. And I think then whatever Moody's rates us will not matter. And in fact, Moody's will rate us better once we get growth back.
All right. Now, you have worked with the NITI Aayog for 3 years and you handled the trade and the economics department. So what role can NITI Aayog play in the post-COVID-19 economy?
So I think NITI Aayog's role is twofold in my view. One is, of course, as a think tank of the government, it has to push the envelope on reform. So the things we're talking about, land, labor, they're the ones who should, be radical about it in terms of their proposals. And they have come up with some number of interesting policies on land leasing and land pooling and various other things which can help the land problem. The second, and I think the critical role that NITI Aayog needs to play now is coordination of the states, because a lot of these reforms, whether it's land, labor, we talked about even health, education, critical reforms for India going forward need the support of the states, need action from the states. So NITI Aayog is not the planning commission. It doesn't dictate to states, which is a good thing. It doesn't decide how they spend their money, which is also a good thing. It must use, therefore, its intellectual firepower and its obviously its status as a entity of the central government to persuade states and to work with states to push the reform agenda. And I think in this current crisis, in this COVID crisis, while we still grapple with it over the next 6 to 8 months, NITI Aayog must also play a greater coordination role. I think the one thing we've seen sometime in this crisis is that sometimes the coordination between center and states is not happening. States are doing their own thing, closing borders, taking their own decisions. So I think that coordination role is needed. But more than that, going forward, pushing the reform agenda and persuading the states to adopt the reform agenda. These are the two critical things that NITI Aayog must do.
Okay. So it was great having you over, Mr. Dhiraj, and we thank you for your time and your great insights on the economy of India right now. And we hope to see more of you on the platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and I hope it's useful, and I hope that the economy recovers sooner at the soonest, and hopefully, in the best case scenario, if this virus subsides and if we do a fiscal stimulus, maybe in the second half of the year we'll start seeing things turn around. But I would say save your optimism for the next year. This year, just hang in there. All businesses, individuals need to conserve their energy and survive, and then they'll thrive once the economy recovers.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.